everybody, and welcome to my first video. I need to work on that sounding natural. We'll get there. We have to figure out what my cadence is. If you're watching this video in like 2027 because you love my content so much and you're like, I want to watch all of her old stuff, hi, hello, really warm welcome to you, because I don't really believe you're there. For me, it's kind of like, oh, maybe people I know are here. So if you're here in the future, like, hello from the past. So before we get into the actual book, I do want to make sure I say that this video, well, this should say the series and this books are going to be in multiple parts. This is my first real video I've ever made. So, you know, I don't have the equipment, none of that fancy stuff to make long videos. Plus, I would be waiting forever. And we just want to get it. I wanted to make mention, I will be referring to L.M. Montgomery as the author throughout these videos, and that is intentional. L.M. Montgomery was a very real person. I want to be very delicate with her legacy. When an artist puts so much of themselves into their work, it's natural to sit there and go, oh, but she must have been like this. So for us, the author is unknown. We don't know who published this work unless I say her name. If I say her name, I am giving you something that is actual fact, could be looked up. Besides for that, this is my opinions and my opinions alone. Another little bit of housekeeping. If you have not read the books yet, I do recommend it. It's not required to read the books, but I think it'll just enhance your experience. I listen to the audiobooks personally. That was a really good way. All right. 2020. I needed something to listen. My brain kind of went back to the last season of Anne with an E, and I watched the whole show again, and I was kind of like, you know what? I want to read those books. I want to know what the real story is. As I worked through my own trauma, I found myself healing and really relating to Anne. I just kept reading it over and over again. It would end, go right back to the beginning. And after a while, I was like, okay, let's see what else the author has. And I found a series called Emily of New Moon, and I was like, you know what? We're gonna check that one out, because Emily of New Moon is kind of interesting sounding. It's very gothic sounding. So I was like, yeah, we'll check out Emily of New Moon. Anne had a cheery way of like getting through everything, and I really found it as a comfort. But Emily was different. Emily was skeptical. Just realized I didn't put my lip gloss on. Whoops. You know what? That's enough. Okay, restarting. Hi, yes, new day here. I was gonna re-record this intro because that was so short so far, but I decided not to because I kind of think that it's funny that I went to put on lip gloss, like, oh no, I forgot my lip gloss, and then immediately I was like, no, I'm done. Keep in mind, as I go through this part of my script, everything I say right now, think of it as more of a thesis. I know as we go, my views will change, my opinions will change, all along with me, and we'll see. Where Anne kind of super easily brushes off her trauma when giving stories and focuses on the happier things, like going outside and playing, Emily is different. Emily really, because she's got a lot going on. A lot of darker things happen to Emily. I've only read that series through once, and the reason for that was once I was inspired to do something with this to look further, I didn't want my views tainted. So I've read Anne a million times, stopped reading it when I realized I wanted to make these videos, and Emily I have not read since. So I wanted my second time to be here with you guys. So like and subscribe, so I feel the inspiration to get there. I was gonna go in more here reflecting on the two different characters and their differences and similarities, but I kind of think that we should more just jump into it. The best case would probably be to go into that more once we get to Emily. This is kind of my start baseline. Anne is like the idealized inner, as if for me, the author was like, this is how I wish I saw myself as a kid. Like, this is how myself as a kid maybe felt. And then Emily is like, nah, this is what happens when a child goes through a lot of trauma. I'm sure as we go through Anne, I'll probably comment a little bit on hers. I have a feeling I will find a lot more instances where she's not as bright and cheery as I am remembering. And it has a lot to do with how it helped me. So I'm so excited to share. So we are going to talk about L.M. Montgomery for a second. After reading Emily, I kind of had to look her up a little bit because I was like, okay, there's too many similarities to me in my brain to how I am, and I want to know, is that just, am I imagining that? Now, trigger warning for self-harm. I learned in my research, very, very surface research, the age of 67, L.M. Montgomery unfortunately lost her battle with her mental health. I don't know what factors were in there. I didn't look. I'm sure they weren't shared. I mean, it's big that the family shared that happened and that she just didn't pass away. That was kind of enough research for me to put down the research to say, okay, I want to talk about this from my own angle, and then at the end kind of go into more of her. So we will do that after the two series. We'll go more into her her herself and what kind of legacy is there, and we'll talk more about the facts. So before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of this, I wanted to just do another kind of little housekeeping note. As this is most historical pieces of art or work, there are going to be things that don't measure up whatsoever to the standards of society today. I just wanted to give that general warning. Okay, so friends, grab a comfy blanket, a snack, some laundry, whatever you're doing with this video. Please tell me if you put me on in the background. It would be an honor. That would be such an honor. So friends, I present to you my analysis of Anne of Green Gables. Okay, chapter 1, Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. So the first chapter in this book, we get from the perspective of Mrs. Rachel Lynde. We get a beautiful description of her house right away. And I'm actually going to read the first paragraph in the book, or should I say the first sentence. Our author was somebody who absolutely loves Oxford comma, regular comma, just continuing the sentence forever, and I stand that. That is me. That is me. Everything I say is like a long paragraph, and if I could sit there and actually put in the punctuation, yeah. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with adlers and ladies, eavesdrops and travelers, by a brook that had its own source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. Okay, I accidentally at one point somehow did search and find and changed specific phrases into Mrs. Rachel Lynde every time. Okay, so it was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in the earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets and pools and cascades, but by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream. Not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. He was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel Lynde was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed by, from brooks and children up, and if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores therefore of. Wow. One whole sentence. One thing that this author does really well is she shows instead of tells you a lot of things. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is the type of person that knows everything to the degree that even nature knows that she knows everything. She's always watching. Love that. I mean, from that first sentence, we already know so much about her, and you could probably even think of somebody in your own life already who is a Mrs. Rachel Lynde. I know. I know I can. So we find her sitting by her window, watching everything going on outside. She prides herself on being the type to manage their own concerns and those of other folks in the bargain. She's a housewife with a house in order. She ran the sewing circle, helped Sunday school, and was the most active member of the Society Church Aid. You get it. Very, very busy woman, helping out as much as she can, and yet still has time to sit down by her window, making quilts, taking in everything that goes by, and sometimes getting her nose a little too much. A lot of times getting her nose a little too much into other people's business. So already, just from that first bit, we know so much about Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Her husband, Thomas Lynde, is known as Rachel Lynde's husband, which gives you enough about him. I could just see this shy, meek little man under the foot of his controlling, dominating wife. So while she's sitting by the window, she doesn't have to really wait long for something to go by that perks her interest. Because there was Matthew Cuthbert in a suit with a white collar going into town in his little buggy. Immediately her mind starts running and deducing in her an internal monologue. She wonders, why isn't Matthew working on the farm? I mean, to be fair, any other man would not have caused this reaction. She's not out of place to be shocked. I mean, any other man will change their mind, go into town instead of working on the farm like they said they would, but not Matthew Cuthbert. She goes into right now what I call full Mrs. Rachel mode. She ponders why the shyest man on all of earth is going out on a day where he planned to work on the farm. Her brain goes a million miles a minute, and I can almost imagine it kind of like BBC's Sherlock mode, where you got everything going around and she's just interpreting everything really quickly. And again, here we have a setup of Matthew already. Matthew is the type of man who it's shocking that he changes his mind and goes into town wearing a suit. He's not somebody who seeks out human interaction, and in fact, he avoids it like a disease. We won't even meet him until chapter 2, and already there's a sense of knowing about his character. And of course, Mrs. Rachel isn't able to just sit with the discomfort. She heads on over to Green Gables to visit Matthew's sister, Marilla, who lives with him. So on her way over, there's literal walls of text of Mrs. Rachel Lynde trying to rationalize what she had just seen. Green Gables is the furthest house away from town and society. Matthew and Marilla's father, who was even shyer than Matthew, built the house with the notion to put it as the book says, as far away as he could from his fellow man without retreating into the woods. Now, we've already been clued into the fact that Matthew is shy. So shy that leaving his house dressed up is a cause for concern. This is something that really stuck with me and sticks with me as I get to know the siblings. They've improved themselves compared to the generation before them, and yet still very much keep to the ways of which they grew up. Eventually, as the book says, Mrs. Rachel Lynde stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal, the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she's one of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard as often as she swept her house, and she's her best friend, so that spoiler, but one could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming about the proverbial peck of dirt. Yeah, no, I wouldn't put it past Marilla either to be sweeping her yard, to be honest. Before even entering the door of the house, Mrs. Rachel Lynde already notices that there are 3 place settings on the table. There's Marilla and Matthew, and the food was not fancy enough to be for a fancy guest, but there was Matthew driving to town with his white collar and his suit on the day that he should have been working on the farm. She gets literally dizzy from wonder. Girl, I can't. Well, there's a little bit of Mrs. Rachel in all of us, let's be real. And I love the way that the author describes the friendship between Marilla and Rachel Lynde by saying something for the lack of any other name might be called friendship existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. And then here's where we get our first description of our lovely Lady Marilla, once again exposing more of her character and the dissimilarities. Marilla is described in the book as a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind with 2 wire hairpins stuck aggressively. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid consciousness, which she was. There was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered an indicator of a sense of humor. Marilla is no nonsense and follows the rules to keep things in order. She looks as rigid as she absolutely can be, while Mrs. Rachel has absolutely no issue cracking a joke. Marilla might perhaps hide her giggle or her smile, turn around and just go, or at least do her best to try to. For there is, like it was stated, that hint of a sense of humor. A hint that is not quite hardened over, perhaps just in need of waking up. Knowing Mrs. Rachel, Marilla was not at all surprised when she showed up at her door. She actually kind of expected it. She's very direct and to the point, while Rachel will sometimes skirt around issues. Immediately, she lets Mrs. Rachel Lynde's wandering mind know that Matthew went to pick up a little boy from the asylum in Nova Scotia who was supposed to come home and help on the farm. I love this line. She says, and I quote, "If Marilla had said Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel Lynde could not have been more astonished." I mean, she's silent for a full 5 seconds, which, as I'm sure you've already figured out, is kind of a rarity for Rachel. Her brain works pretty quickly. She knew Marilla couldn't be lying, but almost thinks that she is. Marilla responds in a manner that makes adopting a little boy that you've never met from a home in Nova Scotia the most sane thing you can do in early June. Mrs. Rachel quite disagrees. Internally, Mrs. Rachel is convinced nothing could shock her after this, and she expresses that sentiment right to Marilla. And she asks what in the world would make Marilla want to do this. Marilla explains it's been something on her mind all winter after Mrs. Spencer mentioned before Christmas that she was getting a little girl in the spring. After discussing the topic, Marilla and Matthew decided on a boy, as Matthew is 60 and needs help around the farm. She mentions how the only other help are those stupid half-little grown French boys, which I can't even begin to dissect. What that means? She complains that as soon as you get him to a point where you want him, he just goes and grows up and goes and does something else in life. He leaves for the Canaries or he goes to the United States, which I'll admit does not sound ideal in terms of getting help. Marilla explains how a home-born Canadian would be the safest option. The reasons she gives for all the other options being non-viable are filled with racism, classism, ignorance, and fear, to put it mildly. Marilla has quite a few moments like this in the books. Point to well-written characters, I think, is that you see the good and the bad in them, and that this author likes to show, not tell. People are not just one color, but rather a kaleidoscope that's ever-changing. Marilla, you can tell, is afraid of everything and everyone. Everything and everyone that is not a white, English-speaking Canadian. A fear that was probably instilled into her at a very young age by said shy father. As if somebody who was born in the same country never do harm, could never, ever, ever be a bad person. Marilla even states that the best option would even be Nova Scotian born. There's a risk regardless, but a born Canadian from near home sounds like the best option for her. Mrs. Rachel reminds her that murderers still exist in Native Canadian people too, which, again, that's not Native Canadians, Rachel. Okay, but go off. Marilla continues to say that they sent off for a boy around the age of 10 or 11, old enough to do chores and young enough to be trained properly with a home and schooling. Having a moment to kind of adjust to the news, Rachel gets right back into her mode and doesn't hold back in telling Marilla how bad of an idea it is to bring a strange boy into the home. Honestly, she's real for this. She is pretty much saying that it doesn't matter who it is. There's a risk. Regardless, where they're from makes no difference. Sorry. Birds. Birds. Aw, you guys looking for a nest? Don't make it in those gutters. Oh, you're drinking some. Oh, getting some water, I think. I had to find where I was. Marilla is definitely a fearful, shy person, while Mrs. Rachel has more of a grasp of the world. She reminds Marilla that even white Canadians can come with risks and tells her a bunch of stories that she's heard about asylum boys, one of which was burning down the house that they were staying in or acting in other terrifying ways. Again, kind of yay for Mrs. Rachel kind of pointing out that race, all of that has nothing to do with whether a person is good or bad. I mean, she didn't exactly say that entirely, but I think that was the point, a risk. It's a risk to take in a child you've never met, comes from a bad background regardless. Now, I'm not saying ethically if I agree or not. I see what she is saying by you are the shyest, most timid people. Marilla, what are you doing? What are you doing? Mrs. Rachel even points out that Marilla never asked her opinion on the matter. I mean, she could have helped her see sense. But Marilla is completely unfazed and states that she had her own doubts herself, but Matthew is so hard set on the idea. And when it comes to Matthew being set on something, Marilla usually gives in. She then talks about all the different risks you face in life besides adopting children, which makes the whole conclusion she made about all non-white Canadians, local Canadians being issues, completely mute. Because exactly, anybody can be. And I think that's a point that shows just the difference between the two characters. Mrs. Rachel is kind of a little bit more worldly than Marilla, and somehow their friendship works. And as you go through the whole book series, I just kind of think about that dynamic, and I just love watching them both grow as people. Marilla even states, you can have your own child and they can turn out wrong. Marilla. Marilla. Mrs. Rachel again tries to warn Marilla of the dangers by mentioning another story she heard about a little girl this time poisoning a well. And Marilla makes sure to say, oh, well, we're not getting a girl, so we're good. We're good. But what difference does that make, Marilla? She goes on and on about how she would never dream to try to raise a girl. This is like where I want to put the I know something you don't know, or I know something you don't. I know something you will never know. I don't know if I'm going to use sounds, so let me know. Do you think these videos would be great with like the little sounds in the background, or do you like just talking? Just give me feedback. I'd love some feedback. Realizing Matthew wouldn't be home for a few hours, Mrs. Rachel doesn't really see the sense to stay and wait for him to come back home, and rather she goes to report the news to the Bell family. I'll tell ya, there is one person responsible for that gossip wheel being good and greased in Avonlea, and that is Mrs. Rachel. Marilla is absolutely relieved when Mrs. Rachel leaves, and almost immediately also her own doubts are reignited. I thought the lady doth protest too much earlier. She was kind of trying to end her own insecurities, and when Rachel brought them up, defensive. And while she is leaving, Mrs. Rachel thinks to herself about how she is sympathetic of any child that's being raised by those two. At a house where a child has never existed, for when they built it, they were both teenagers. She uses her "that's what" phrase at the end, which is going to be the first of a million. Whenever she says something and she's like, well, there's never been children in that book, that's what. That kind of way. And we are brought to the end of chapter 1. Okay, so now we are on to chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. So this chapter switches us to Matthew Cuthbert's perspective. And this time it's him who is surprised, not Mrs. Rachel Lynde. There's going to be a lot of surprise in this day. So Matthew makes his way to the train station in his buggy, remarking along the way about what a beautiful drive it is that day. He remarks not only on the visual experience, but the sensory experience, and on the beauty of, as the book says, the little bird sang as if it was the only day of summer all year. The only moment his cheerfulness and peace fades is when he has to nod to women on the street. Women are something that Matthew absolutely dreads, save for his sister and Mrs. Rachel Lynde. He was, as the narrator states, probably correct in assuming all women were staring at him, judging him, as Matthew was rather imposing. He had an ungainly figure with long iron gray hair to his shoulders and a soft brown full beard. Minus the gray, Matthew looked the same at 20 as he did at 60. Already a very unchanged man who was very shy. We already told he was shy, but so shy that he fears women. When Matthew gets to the train station, the only person that he sees is this strange little girl. Now, of course, Matthew is not a fan of women, so when he sees this little girl, he pays as little possible interest and attention to her as he can. He absolutely does not want to interact. I mean, he especially is nervous because she looks like she's sitting there and she's waiting for something, and he doesn't see the little boy that they asked for. She sat waiting with everything inside of her. Matthew was shocked when he asked the train conductor about the little boy, and he is instead pointed to this little girl, as not only did the train already pass through, but he was told that this little girl was actually waiting for Matthew. Matthew tries to say, no, there's been a mistake, like this is not what we were looking for. And the man confirms that it was Mrs. Spencer herself that told him the little girl was waiting for the Cuthberts. He even tells Matthew that it was told to him that this is the little girl the Cuthberts would be adopting. Talk about a shocker for poor Matthew. He has absolutely no time to process this. I mean, he literally says to himself, why is she not a boy? And now he has to ask this strange girl why she is not a little boy. I'm sure it was such a daunting, terrifying task for him. He makes his way over to the little girl and notices that she's not only looking at him, but studying him. If Matthew had been looking at her, the book says, he would have seen a child who appeared to be about 11 wearing a short, tight, yellowish, gray wincey dress. Now, I had to look up what wincey was, and I don't know if I'll picture whatever of the fabric, because I kind of thought wincey was like wimpy, and it is in fact not. It is, according to Wikipedia, coarse twill or plain woven linen and a woolen weft, which is, I think, the binding. She also had a worn brown sailor hat that covered her two thick red braids of hair and her small white thin, freckled face, adorned large mouth and eyes, which were green or gray, depending on the light. And as the book continues, the closer details are only seen, as the book says, by an extraordinary observer. They would see that the chin was very pointed and pronounced, that the big eyes were full of spirit and vivacity, that the mouth was sweet-lipped and expressive, that the forehead was broad and full. In short, our discerning, extraordinary observer might have concluded that no commonplace soul inhabited the bottle of this stray woman-child, of whom shy Matthew Cuthbert was so ludicrously afraid. These descriptions just get to me, and I know it's because I just love it so much. Before Matthew could even speak, the little girl notices him coming towards her and stands up, holding the handle of an old carpet bag in one hand and extending the other. Before Matthew even says a word, this girl begins to speak very rapidly. So, let me try this one. I suppose you are Mr. Cuthbert of Green Gables, she says in a peculiar, sweet voice. She tells Matthew that she didn't think he was actually coming, and if it got dark, she would have gone and slept in the cherry tree. Actually, she says, you didn't come for me tonight? I'd go down the tracks to that big wild cherry tree, all white with blooms in the moonshine, and climb up into it and stay all night. And it would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree, all white with bloom in the moonshine. Don't you think? You could imagine you were dwelling in marble halls, couldn't you? I was quite sure you'd come for me in the morning, if you didn't tonight. She says all this before Matthew can even shake his head at her. What in first impression this is. Imagine, we already know how much Matthew is uncomfortable talking to women, and here's this little girl with absolutely no restriction to her, just blurting out her story. I could just picture tall, imposing Matthew Cuthbert with this tiny little young sprite. He looks at her and he realizes he is absolutely not equipped to be the one to break the news to this child with the glowing eyes, and decides to wait until they're back at Green Gables. Marilla can handle it. He apologizes to her for being late and offers to take her bag. She tearfully tells him, oh, I can carry it. She explains that everything she owns is in that bag, but it isn't heavy at all. It'll also break if you don't hold it the right way. Now, she admits it would have been really nice to sleep in a tree, but Mrs. Spencer warned her that the trip was 8 miles long and she knew not to dally around. She enthusiastically tells him, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody. Not really. I can't imagine the pit in Matthew's stomach as this little girl pretty much unknowingly guilts him, and he knows that she's not going to be staying. And she continues on immediately to tell Matthew about life at the asylum and how for the 4 months she was there, it was worse than anything you could ever imagine. Mrs. Spencer told her not to say anything wicked like that, but as the girl states, I don't mean to be wicked. It's just so easy to be wicked without knowing, isn't it? As I stated earlier, this is a line that stopped me in my tracks and made me go, whoa there. To this day, I get myself into trouble without even realizing it, and I learn the lesson after I've done something. And I've learned to take that to my advantage and always grow. When I was younger, it definitely caused a lot of hard times when my curiosity would get me into trouble. She explains there's no scope for imagination there, and the only thing that she can imagine is her and the other children. She would still try. She imagined the girl sitting next to her, for instance, was really the daughter of a belted earl who had been stolen away from her parents in her infancy by a cruel nurse who died before she could confess. She spent many nights awake just imagining and imagining, and then inserts one of her self-depreciating comments about how she wishes she was not so skinny and bony. I'd love to imagine I'm nice and plump with dimples in my elbows. Now, Matthew's companion stops talking at this point, and my heart kind of breaks a little bit for her. Thinking of the asylum life and what she must have endured, even though it was only 4 months, and that she had never in her life belonged to anyone, I can't imagine the body image issues she had and how many just cruel comments were made, especially in a situation where no one cared about her well-being. So the rest of the way to the buggy, she stays silent. And yes, this was all before they actually make it back to the buggy. She's just spitfiring off. She is silent until she reaches a steep hill with super soft soil that has caused the road to slip. So the actual road is actually eroded down, and then the trees are several feet above them. Before doing it this way, I never really noticed that description, noticed how just breathtaking that sounds. I can really understand why this is the site that makes Anne come back to life. I probably wouldn't be able to go by a site like that and not comment on it either. She exclaims, "Isn't that beautiful? What did that tree, leaning out from the bank, all white and lacy, make you think of?" She asks Matthew, and Matthew responds with, "Well, I don't know." And that is one of Matthew's absolute catchphrases. Every time I read this part, I kind of get a little smirk to myself because Matthew has never spoke to a girl, voluntarily is responding with no resistance. So of course this is a moment that she shares what she saw. "Why, a bride, of course, a bride all in white with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what it would look like. I don't ever expect to be a bride myself. I'm so homely, no one would ever want to marry me." I have worked on my self-depreciation in therapy, and I've made a lot of progress, especially recently, and I feel so much for Anne here, knowing how much words can impact you, and already we've had one moment that put her into silence of words that have been used against her, and now this. When you're a little different in the best of circumstances, it's easy to feel left out and unloved, but when you are different in the circumstances that Anne grew up with, I it takes a resilience. It definitely takes a resilience to get through. That's what I mean about that kind of she's so small and mighty. And yes, if I haven't mentioned it yet, I wanted to try to be mysterious and not say the girl was Anne and then be like, surprise, it was Anne. But oh my gosh, it is so hard. And plus, we all know who the little girl in this book is going to be. Most people are probably familiar with the basics of the story that is put into every adaptation. And this chapter is specifically one that, if it didn't occur, that's not Anne of Green Gables. Literally in Stranger Things, this is the scene. This might even be the part that they are reading. I don't remember. Anne continues without a break to put herself down, saying the only one who would ever be humble enough to marry her would be a foreign missionary. As long as she has a white dress, which is her highest ideal of earthly bliss, she can resign to it. She loves pretty clothes and has never had a pretty dress in her entire life. She felt very ashamed when she left the asylum because of the way she was dressed. She explains how the wincey made to make her dress came from a merchant in Hopetown last winter who donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Not an ideal dress for a young girl with a broadening imagination. So many people said the reason that he donated it was because it couldn't sell, but Anne admits that she'd like to think it was also out of the kindness of his own heart, out of charity. She imagines herself in a beautiful pale blue silk dress with a hat filled with flowers, along with the appropriate accessories, and she says how this helped her when she was on the boat over with Mrs. Spencer to not get sick. She remarks how Mrs. Spencer said she's usually seasick, but she was too busy making sure Anne didn't fall off the boat with the amount of prowling about that she was doing. And since she didn't get sick, Anne sees this as a win, completely misinterpreting the social situation, which, yeah, same girl, same. She remarks on how everybody told her that Prince Edward Island was the most beautiful place and she just could not wait to live there. She explains that she asked Mrs. Spencer why the roads were red, but she didn't let her know. I looked up the roads because I was like, what does she mean by the roads are red? And it looks like they're clay roads, as seen here, also known as heritage roads, a unique feature of the island. Mrs. Spencer simply tells her she doesn't know why, and for pity's sakes, not to ask her any more questions. She's already fed up with Anne. I'm sure, like me, many of you have had moments like this. You're just curious about the world around you and you ask questions and then someone's like gets fed up, and it's understandable from kind of both angles. But there's definitely no patience when Mrs. Spencer is dealing with Anne. I already can tell you I don't like Mrs. Spencer. I don't trust Mrs. Spencer. We'll see if there's anything else that changes that further for you, but I don't like Mrs. Spencer from the start. She messed with my girl. And I can admit that that was probably an overwhelming trip. You think you're just picking up this little girl and nonstop talking. Matthew already sees her as a gentle little soul who he doesn't mind engaging with, but he also wants to do his best to forget the dilemma that's going to face them when they get home. She asks Matthew if he knows why the roads are red, and he admits that he doesn't know. Anne then does what I do often and asks Matthew if she's talking too much, and offers to stop talking as she can stop when I make up my mind to it, although it is difficult. So this happens a lot with my mom. I end up talking until I have to focus on stopping talking because I realize I've just completely bored her. I definitely self-depreciate, and it's something that I'm really working on actually right now. And I pre-apologize all the time, way too much. In honestly too many conversations, I make sure people know that I can talk a lot, and therefore it almost feels like I have permission to, that I'm not breaking any boundaries talking. These are one of those moments that make me go, oh my gosh, I really identify with this author. I do that all the time. I literally always say, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. But Matthew, however, Matthew is surprised he's actually enjoying himself. As the book says, like most quiet folks, he liked talkative people when they were willing to do the talking themselves and did not expect him to keep up with his end of it. With so many people, I'm the one taking up all the air on the car ride. We already know that Matthew is not fond of women, but he especially is afraid of little girls because they always look at him like they're afraid of him. And even though his brain can't really keep up with what Anne is saying, he realizes he kind of liked her chatter. Matthew tells Anne he doesn't mind the talk, actually, and she says they are going to get along just fine. She's really relieved that Matthew doesn't tell her to be seen and not heard, and admits people always laugh at her for the big words that she uses. It's another one where I can really relate to it, especially as a kid. And it would be like if I learned a new word, I wanted to use that word. One little example from when I was little. Okay, so I was at a party, and I don't know whose it was. It was someone in my preschool, and I was exhausted. And I had recently learned that pooped means you're exhausted. So I went on the couch. I remember I was kind of dizzy, and I was kind of like on the couch. And they're like, oh, what's wrong? And I was like, I'm just pooped. And everyone broke out in laughter, and I remember this confusing feeling of, wait, I wasn't trying to be funny, but they think I'm funny. And so I giggled along with them, and I just remember feeling like I wasn't joking. I am pooped. This was a hard party. It honestly made me feel a little bit uneasy, and I think it was because I wasn't sure if I was the joke that was being laughed at. So back to the story. Anne self-deprecates once again, bringing up her red hair, and sighs that, now you can see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody could who has red hair, and the freckles, and the green eyes, and my skinniness. Oh, poor girl. Again, putting herself down for her appearance, when that sounds like an adorable little kid to me. All little kids are adorable, frankly. She's so young, and it just breaks my heart, because you can only imagine how many times she's had these kind of words thrown at her over and over to diminish how she feels about herself. She says no matter what she does, she can't imagine her red hair away. She tries and she pretends that she's other people, but when she looks right down, she sees that red hair. It's funny because when I was a kid, I would have loved to have red hair. I always wanted red hair. And then when I realized I couldn't have red hair, I wanted to have a ginger child one day. Anne continues talking until she explains, oh, Mr. Cuthbert, over and over when they reach what people call the avenue. 4 to 500 the avenue, a 400 to 500 yard long road arched over with huge, wide spreading apple trees planted years ago by an eccentric old farmer. The view strikes Anne quiet. Overhead was one long canopy of snowy, fragrant blooms. Below, the boughs of the air was full of a purple twilight, and far ahead, a glimpse of a painted sunset sky shone like a great rose window at the end of the cathedral aisle. I know, I've edited enough already to know that I am awful at reading, so we're just gonna go with it. Just know that the fact that I'm getting these words out is for me, frankly. So I can just see this in my head, and I understand exactly why Anne is struck quiet. I mean, even 3 miles gone. She still hasn't spoken, and Matthew is actually the one that speaks up next. He says she must be tired and hungry, and lets her know that they are only a mile away from home. She comes out of her trance and sighs at Matthew, with a very glazed, dazed look in her eye. "Oh, Mr. Cuthbert," she exclaims, asking what the white place was. He tells her it is called the Avenue, and states it is kind of a pretty place. Pretty? Oh, pretty doesn't even seem the right word to use. They don't go far enough. She said it is the first thing that she has ever seen that couldn't be improved upon by the imagination, which for Anne is definitely a strong statement. She says her heart has a funny yet pleasant ache. That is something that I am very familiar with. It's actually a feeling that I am uncomfortable with because for me, excitement and joy sometimes feels like anxiety. And yeah. And she asks Matthew if he's ever experienced this either. And of course, he gets the, well, now, I just can't recollect. Well, now, I just can't recollect. Well, now, I just can't recollect that I ever have. Sorry, my Matthew voice sucks, but I gotta do the voices. She says she has, in fact, before had that pleasant ache, and states the avenue is too simple of a name and decides to instead call it the White Way of Delight. And at this point, she digests the fact that they are only a mile away from Green Gables, and says while she is excited to arrive, she's always sad when pleasant things end. She is so excited to have a home for the first time. And if I was Matthew, I would be absolutely sweating, dreading getting there, going as slow as I could, but also wanting to rush there so it can all be over with. So we get more landscape descriptions here, and I want to share these, as these are places that are mentioned over and over, and it helps to see it in your mind's eye. Below them was a pond, looking almost like a river, so long and winding was it. A bridge spanned it midway, and from there to its lower end, where an amber-hued belt of sand hills shut it in from the dark blue gulf beyond. The water was a glory of many shifting hues, the most spiritual shading of a crocus and rose and the ethereal green, with other elusive tintings for which no name has ever been found. Blech. Above the bridge, the pond ran up into a fringing grove of fir and maple and lay all darkly translucent in their wavering shadows. Here and there, a wild plum leaned out from the bank like a white-clad girl, tiptoeing to her own reflection. From the marsh at the head of the pond came a clear, mournfully sweet chorus of frogs. There was a little gray house peering around a white apple orchard on a slope beyond, and, although it was not quite yet dark, a light was shining from one of the windows. Matthew tells Anne that the pond is called Barry's Pond, and that the Barrys live at the house. Anne asks if the Barrys have a little girl, and, of course, they do. And Matthew tells her about Diana, who is about 11 years old. Now, they also have a little daughter named Minnie, I believe. I think Matthew was sticking to, who's her age, as Minnie is quite literally pretty much a baby. Much appreciated, Matthew, giving us only the facts that are necessary. Anne tells Matthew that she loves the name Diana, while he actually thinks and says that there's something heathenish about it. When they get to the bridge, Anne declares she's going to close her eyes because she is afraid the bridge will crumple up like a jackknife. But when she gets to the middle, she opens her eyes because if the bridge did crumple up, she'd want to see the crumple. When they are over the bridge, she decides to say goodnight to the Lake of Shining Waters, as she refers to it, and says it looks as if the water is looking up, smiling right back at her. Matthew tries to point out Green Gables to her, but before he can, Anne declares she wants to guess for herself. Despite the fact that the sun was setting, the world was still just visible in the afterlight. To the west, a dark church spire rose up against a marigold sky. Below it was a little valley, and beyond, a long, gently rising slope with snug farmsteads along it. Finally, Anne correctly points out what she exactly thinks is Green Gables. Matthew supposes that Mrs. Spencer gave her a description, but Anne insists she only saw it and knew it was her home. She states her arm must be black and blue from all the pinching she's been doing to herself. Until suddenly, she remembers that even supposing it was a dream, she'd better go on dreaming as long as she could. Her excitement about going to Green Gables makes Matthew, as you could probably understand, very uncomfortable. He is absolutely stirring and shifting in his seat. Grateful it's going to be Marilla who has to tell this girl that she isn't staying and not him. They drove right through Lynde's Hollow, where, of course, Mrs. Lynde was waiting right at that window to see them go by. The closer Matthew gets to Green Gables, the more terrified he is of breaking Anne's heart. He feels as if he is assisting in murdering something, like the times that he has to kill a lamb or a baby animal. Oh, listen to the trees talking in their sleep, she says as Matthew helps her out of the cart and states what nice dreams they must have. She follows him into the house, holding the carpet bag with all of her worldly goods, even though I know what comes next, and so does Matthew. All these new emotions he's feeling. At the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. I've never really paid attention to the chapter titles before, frankly, when I really read at all, but this time around I noticed, and I have to laugh at the fact that 3 chapters in a row, someone is surprised. So when Marilla opens the door, she asks Matthew who the heck this girl is, and where's the little boy that they ordered. Matthew, wretchedly, tells her, well, there wasn't any boy, there was only her. And then he realizes at that moment that he never asked her for her name. Marilla insists again that there should be a boy. She was very, very clear. The two go back and forth, and while they do, Anne remains silent, following both speakers with her eyes kind of. Once she grips what's being said, she says, "You don't want me?" she cried. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy. I might have expected it. Nobody ever did want me. I might have known it was all too beautiful to last. I might have known nobody really did want me. Oh, what shall I do? I'm going to burst into tears." And with that, Anne bursts into tears. It's really difficult when you allow yourself to be really excited about something only for that one thing to completely just fall apart. It's, like I said earlier, why I don't like excitement. I don't enjoy the feeling. It just feels like anxiety, and it just feels like something that's going to come crashing down. And I have to learn to kind of differentiate for myself. So Anne flings herself into a chair and just starts sobbing. Matthew and Marilla kind of look at each other, wanting the other one to say something to her. And lamely as it's described, tells Anne, well, there's no reason to cry about it, so. Of course, she doesn't know children, so she doesn't know that this absolutely adds fuel to the fire that is Anne's sobs. I mean, of course there is a reason to cry when you suddenly think you're gonna have a home and it's all ripped away from you the second you get there and start to appreciate it and are comfortable. Marilla hasn't exactly had, like I said, a lot of time around children, and so she has no idea how to talk to them. Anne raises her tear-stained face and reminds Marilla there is, in fact, absolutely a need to cry right now. And Marilla herself would cry too if she was an orphan girl who thought she finally had a home, and instead they realized they were not wanted because of their gender, because they were a girl and not a boy. Just the thought of what this sweet young soul has been through, only just to be disappointed here is awful. I mean, she recalls a few little things of her past, PTSD moments where she mentions them like they're nothing and puts herself down. I think I'll say a million times my heart breaks for her in this video, at least at the beginning. I mean, imagine, literally, from her perspective, her not being a boy is the reason that she's not wanted. Anne goes on and on about different traumas she has from her past and like the wimpy dress and why they could never ever want her, especially the fact that she's not a boy. And this is a moment that brings our first little smile to Marilla's mouth. Something like a reluctant smile, rather rusty from long disuse, mellowed Marilla's grim expression. This makes me smile, just a hint of humor on her lips. And already, from just this one interaction with Anne, Marilla is already changing. Well, don't cry any more, she says, stating they won't throw her out onto the street. They'll investigate what happened, that's all. She then asks Anne's name. And this is one of my favorite Anne moments, so I'm absolutely going to read it from the text. The child hesitated for a moment. "Will you please call me Cordelia?" she said eagerly. "Call you Cordelia? Is that your name?" No, it's not my name, but I would love to be called Cordelia. It's such a perfectly elegant name." Well, I love this part because it's absolutely funny from an adult perspective. It does remind me again of those moments where, as a kid, you're being absolutely serious and you're talking to someone and they take it as a joke and they don't understand the depth of the emotion. And I think that's one of the scariest things about being a kid is you can't express your emotions properly until you're older, until it's too late. And while this is not like some big moment, like something happened to Anne, it's just one of those little moments that made me think about it and kind of made me reflect so fast in the book. I mean, from Anne's perspective, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. Going back to the text, Marilla says, "If Cornelia isn't your name, what is?" Anne admits her name is Anne Shirley, but still begs to be called Cordelia as Anne is such an unromantic name. There's more of this funny back and forth where Marilla tells Anne she should not be ashamed of her name. Anne explains she's not ashamed, per se, but she likes Cordelia better. She concedes that if she has to be called Anne, that Marilla makes sure it is Anne spelled with an E. Hence the name Anne with an E for the TV show. And Marilla says, very well then, Anne spelled with an E. Can you tell us how this mistake came to be made? Oh my god, I have fucking something in my eye. Makeup's all over. Whatever, I'm not fixing it. Marilla says, very well then, Anne with an E. Can you tell us how this mistake came to be made? She asks if there wasn't any more boys at the asylum, what exactly happened. Anne insists while there are a lot of boys at the asylum, Mrs. Spencer specifically said that Marilla wanted a little girl just like she was getting, and the matron thought that Anne would do. Anne asks why she was ever taken from the station in the first place, shown the white way of delight and the lake of shining waters, if she wasn't going to be able to keep it. It wouldn't have been so hard for her if she had not had that beautiful view, not had taken in what was going to be her home. Marilla is very confused because, these are Anne's names for places, and she asks Matthew, what on earth does she mean? And then Matthew, of course, she's referring to some conversation we had on the road. He says hastily before saying he's going to go and put the mare in and wants tea when he returns. I actually have a mug to drink this out of. Shout out to Dick DeRamio. Marilla continues to inquire about Anne, to Anne, asking if anyone else came. She said that little Lily Jones went to stay with Mrs. Spencer. She says that Lily is very beautiful and asks Marilla if she had Lily's nut brown hair, if they would keep her. Personally, at this point, with the amount of putting herself down Anne has done, if I was Marilla, no, that's my child now. That is my child. And Marilla tries to ease her worries in Marilla's way and explains that no, they wanted a boy to help around on the farm. Nothing more. There's nothing else with Anne specifically that makes them not want to keep her. They just needed help. When Matthew returns, she beckons Anne to come and eat, and Anne insists that she cannot. Quite literally, she's in fact in the depths of despair. And questions Marilla if she could ever eat in that state. Marilla says she can't relate, and Anne questions if she could at least try to. And Anne tries to explain what the feeling feels like and asks if Marilla knows what it's like when you try to eat a lump, comes right up your throat and you can't swallow any, not even if it was chocolate caramel. I'm not going to assume for everybody if you've felt what Anne is talking about, but I sure as heck know I have. I think we've all had moments with that lump in our throat, whether it's breaking up with someone, having a hard conversation, having been told something really tragic. Matthew suggested the girl is simply tired and should be put to bed. Marilla wonders where exactly Anne can possibly sleep. The couch she prepared was fine for a little boy, but did not feel right somehow to put a little girl there. She thinks about it and decides the only appropriate spot is in the East Gable room. Hence, Anne of Green Gables goes deeper than just the fact that the house has gables, and it's called Green Gables. It's the fact that she lives in the Green Gable. Her bedroom is in the... Sorry, getting ahead of myself. I am so passionate. Truly, Anne of Green Gables. So Marilla brings up Anne to the spotless room and sets down a candle. She asks if Anne has a nightgown, and Anne responds she has two very skimpy ones, like the clothes always are in the asylum. She hates them, but she does mention that she can dream and imagine just as well if it was a beautiful one. Marilla then leaves for Anne to change, taking the candle with her, recalling her conversation earlier with Mrs. Rachel about girls from the asylum burning down their house, and stating that she absolutely does not need her house burned down. A little cute moment to bring forth the fear Marilla has. And it almost feels like the first hint of her resolve breaking, like that first little crack. She tries to be seen as this tough, hard, strong-willed, stubborn woman, when in fact Marilla has a heart. When Marilla leaves, Anne takes a moment to look around the room, noting the whitewashed walls were painfully bare to the point that they must ache, as well as the floor. There was a braided mat/rug that Anne noticed on the floor that she had never seen the likes of before. Above the rug was a mirror, and then between the mirror and the bed, there was a window. The room had such a rigid feel, she notices, just like the rest of the house does. Oh, there's the raven. Hi, buddy. So Anne gets dressed pretty quickly and gets into her bed, covering her head with the covers, and buries her face in the pillow. When Marilla comes back up, she notices that the only sign that anyone was in this room at all was the skimpy clothes on the floor. Good night, she says a little bit awkwardly, but not unkindly. Once again, it's one of those moments. Marilla is really trying. She really is. She doesn't know exactly what to say. She hasn't been a little girl in a long time. She doesn't interact with children. And so to her, saying goodnight is quite innocent, right? Right? Wrong. It's kerosene. When anyone is upset like that, generally there's no words that help. And one thing that I have learned personally is you come to a conversation when both parties are calm. If both parties are not calm, then well, you get Anne saying, "How can you call it a good night when you know it must be the very worst night I have ever had?" And she dives right back down into her invisibility. Marilla isn't sure what to say and goes downstairs to wash the dishes. Marilla notices that Matthew is smoking, and he only smokes when his mind is racing, and she smiles to herself, knowing that he needs some way to let his emotions out as a man. He's probably not used to feelings besides contentness, being alone, being on his farm, being with his sister, and just kind of that bliss of being in your own zone when he's working. Marilla states that somehow Richard Spencer's folks made a mistake. They twisted up the message one way or another, and the next day she's gonna have to go there and send her back. "Yeah, I suppose so," says Matthew reluctantly. Marilla says, "You suppose so," back in a mocking tone, saying that she knows so. "Well, now, she's a real nice little thing, Marilla," Matthew says. "It's kind of a pity to send her back when she's so set on staying here." So this is the moment the battle is absolutely won. Even if Marilla wants to pretend, she is still not going to keep this girl. Marilla is absolutely astonished at Matthew's response, and Matthew uncomfortably tries to backtrack, saying that they wouldn't be expected to, and Marilla snaps back, "Matthew Cuthbert, I believe that child has bewitched you. I can see as plain that you want to keep her." And Matthew admits it, telling Marilla a little bit about his drive with her. Marilla gets even colder in her words, a real sign that her resolve is breaking. She is trying to avoid the feelings that she is feeling. She states, well, if she picked up an orphan girl, it wouldn't exactly be Anne. Which, yeah, I know is out of anger, but ouch! Like I said, that would be my daughter. That would be my child, and she would be completely nourished from the start. Matthew offers that he could hire a French boy, and no, before you get excited, that is one of the things the show made up. There is no Jerry, I believe his name was in the show. I haven't watched it until after this. That will be a lot of fun. He then inserts that Marilla could really use some company and then concedes going to bed. Meanwhile, upstairs, Anne is crying herself to sleep while Marilla goes to bed frowning. Not a good first night at all. And with that, we are at the end of chapter 3. I can't believe how fast this is going for me. I can't believe how much fun I'm having. So let's get into chapter 4. All right, chapter 4, Morning at Green Gables. We start this chapter with no one being surprised, which frankly is kind of a good thing because it seems like the surprises keep getting worse and worse and more traumatic for Anne. The night is behind us and it is now morning. Anne wakes up confused at the flood of light and the beauty of the sunshine that is flowing into her room that morning. For a moment, she forgets what's going on and her situation, and she's absolutely delighted. But really quickly, she remembers this is Green Gables, and they don't want her here because she's not a boy. I hope during the night she wasn't too self-attacking, but it's one of those moments where it kind of makes me think about, is it the author's description of Anne that's cheery, or is it Anne that's cheery? Because we didn't see the harsh moments right there. They were hidden from us. We didn't hear the harsh words Anne put against herself. We didn't quite get the same feeling from it. And that's definitely a moment writing the script that I was kind of like, you know what? We didn't get to hear what Anne was going on about that night. We didn't get to hear her call herself horrible names or anything like that. And it's the start of what made me say in the beginning that my views will probably change, because they kind of are. Anne quickly gets out of bed and goes over to the window with absolute delight. She decides she will pretend she gets to stay. There was so much scope for imagination there. The cherry tree outside is described, along with the fact that there is an orchard on both sides of the house, one of apples and one of cherries. The smell of the flowers reaches the house and envelops her. She looks at the hill and she notices the berry house that she saw earlier, the little gray house. To the left there are barns, and over the fields the sea could even be seen. We don't get a lot of time spent at the shore in these books, and I really kind of wish we did, because after all, this is Prince Edward Island. While Anne is admiring the view, Marilla comes in and tells her that it is time to get dressed. Anne points to the outside, calling it absolutely wonderful, completely missing the point. Marilla states the fruit from those trees are usually full of worms and too tiny to be eaten, refusing to allow her heart to even open up to the possibility that there is beauty outside. Anne, at her young age, has already learned the power of gratitude. In the worst of times and the hardest times, you gotta find something to be grateful for, something to be happy about, or the world is just never gonna seem bright. Practicing gratitude has become something for me that is very, very important. And I always find something to be grateful for. Like right now, I'm going through a lot mentally, and I'm here. I'm finally starting this. I am so grateful to be here. Genuinely. I mean, you gotta too take a second to look at nature, to be grateful for what's around you. Anne clarifies to Marilla that she didn't just mean the trees, she meant everything. The whole view, everything that is visible. And as much as I desire to show you guys all the gorgeous descriptions in this book, I am very conscious of not taking up too much time, and that's kind of why, read the books, because no matter what I say, even if I read 50% of the text to you, you'd still be missing so much. I'm going to summarize this up and remind you once again to read the books if you want to. Let me know if there's any interest in like a Fable book club where you can have the books and kind of follow along as I go. Read the books at your own pace, but whichever book I'm on videos for will be the book that's up in the club. Let me know. Comments below if that's something you'd be interested in. In Anne's own absolutely whimsical words, she describes how cheerful the brooks are. Even in the winter, always flowing. She exclaims she will always remember the brook at Green Gables. She then bursts into a speech about how absolutely special it is to have mornings, and how on this very particular one, imagining this was her home brought her so much comfort, even if it was short. Marilla cannot handle this and tells Anne to get dressed and go downstairs to eat. It is time for breakfast. Anne is downstairs in 10 minutes time with her clothes neatly on, her hair brushed and her braided face washed. Her hair brushed and her hair brushed and braided, her face washed, and a comfortable consciousness pervading her soul that she had fulfilled all of Marilla's requirements. Yeah, her braided face. The only thing she forgot about was making the bed. She also announces her fast is officially over, and she is absolutely hungry. She admits the world doesn't feel as cruel as it did the night before anymore to her, and this was the moment that made me go, dang, Anne would be a real big fan of 21 Pilots. Ode to Sleep would be her absolute anthem. In all seriousness, though, everything feels so much worse right after, and I've learned to crave that feeling when you're finally over the wave, when you finally can start feeling good. I crave it not in a way where I try to add bad stuff happen, but more I crave getting out of that mind state. Anne goes on and on about mornings and rainy mornings, and Marilla finally says, "For pity's sake, hold your tongue." And she says she talks too much for a girl. So Anne holds her tongue, as she told Matthew that she could. And this is one of those moments, too. The real kindredship between Matthew and Anne really shows here, as when she asked Matthew if she needed to stop talking, he said, no, keep talking, and realized he kind of liked it, whereas Marilla absolutely requires that seen and not heard feeling, and it probably triggers Anne. I know when I have to be quiet and I have to really think about it, it's definitely more of a task of putting myself down, so that I stay quiet. It's taken me a lot of work to get myself over that, and it's one of those things where I just hope Anne didn't go through the same. It more makes me feel like the author understands that feeling and kind of starts to perk that question in my mind of, who exactly is this person? Who is this person that wrote this? And why do I connect so much to this? And if this is something you struggle with yourself, go ahead in the comments, talk about it. Only if you're, and at any point, if there's anything. Why am I explaining comments to you? Just, there was a definite weight in the air, a feeling that her silence was absolutely not natural. I mean, Anne basically dissociates, which, yeah, that's probably what I was looking to say earlier. She basically stares out the window and just dissociates, and the more that this goes on, the more nervous it makes Marilla. I mean, in fact, the text says, she had an uncomfortable feeling that while this odd child's body might be there at the table, and her spirit was far in some remote, airy cloudland. So, yeah. The dissociation. Marilla remarks how she knows that Matthew wants to keep Anne, and once Matthew makes up his mind, there's no changing it. In her head, of course. Anne comes back down to earth and offers to wash the dishes. I mean, Marilla asks if she can, and while Anne says she's better looking after children, she can still do it. Marilla admits she doesn't know what to do with Anne, and that Matthew is the most ridiculous man. Now, Anne admits she finds Matthew quite lovely, and frankly very sympathetic. She loves the way he doesn't mind listening to her talk, and even seems to enjoy it. She said she knew he was a kindred spirit as soon as I ever saw him. Marilla says, and I quote, "You're both queer enough, if that's what you mean by kindred spirits." You heard it here, folks. Message done. Anne is... Just kidding. I know words have many, many meanings. Marilla reminds Anne of how to do the dishes properly and then sets her on the task. She says in the afternoon they will go on over to the Spencer's house and figure out what exactly has happened. And she's hoping for some sort of a solution and never actually says, no, we're not keeping you, or no, I won't take you. I mean, like I said, Matthew already has made the decision even if Marilla doesn't want to admit it quite yet. I don't know if you know someone like that who you know their answer is going to be yes, but dang, do they put you through the ringer just trying to get there. After washing the dishes, Anne goes up and attempts to make her bed. She does her best to make it smooth, and Marilla doesn't really want to deal with her anymore, so she tells her to go on outside and play until dinner. And dinner, of course, meaning lunchtime. Anne flies over to the door and then stops herself short. When Marilla asks why, Anne admits that she won't ever recover if she plays at Green Gables. Her love for it would be far too high. She instead changes the subject by asking Marilla what the name of her geranium in the window is. She wants to call it Bonnie while she's there, and Marilla does not care. Marilla is already starting to be like, whatever, Anne. Marilla does not care if she calls it Bonnie. She's more confused as to why the girl would do such a thing. Anne says she loves naming everything and anything because it makes them feel more like people. She wonders if it hurts the plant to not be seen as an individual, and ding ding ding, the "this reminds me of me," this reminds me of me moment. Let's just say, as many kids of my generation, Toy Story absolutely shaped my imagination, and not in a way that I could say was for the best. It gave me a lot of anxiety, a lot of attachment to objects, and encouraged me to hoard my stuff. And yeah, sometimes I have to stop myself from humanizing a piece of plastic. Reduce, reuse, recycle, even if the world feels like it's on fire. Anne absolutely insists that the geranium's name is Bonnie, and the cherry tree in front is named the Snow Queen, because it is so white right now, even though it won't be all year. I have never in my life seen or heard anything equal to her, Marilla. Mutters Marilla. She makes an excuse to go in the basement and get potatoes and uses the moment to think out loud to herself. She admits she'll be casting a spell over me too. She's cast it over with Matthew. She's already hooked. She's locked in. She's sat down. She doesn't realize it, but you're also enthralled with this little girl, ma'am. When Marilla returns from the basement, she sees that Anne is looking out the window with an intense focus and decides to just let her be until dinner. Marilla makes sure that she can have the horse and buggy. Matthew nods while looking over at Anne. Marilla, speaking void of any emotion, explains her plan to figure this all out. She says she will be home in time to milk the cows alone. Matthew says nothing, and Marilla feels like she has absolutely wasted her words. Yeah, because Matthew knows what we know. When Matthew speaks his mind, Marilla gives in, because Matthew barely ever speaks his mind. So they eat and they head out, and as the buggy is leaving, Matthew mentions to Marilla that he's gone over and hired little Jerry Boot. So yes, Jerry is actually in this. It's not the same character. He's not the one that ends up with Diana. Spoiler alert. Ding, ding, ding. He is not really a prominent character. But yeah, he mentions that he hired Jerry for the summer. She responds with a hard tap on the mare, and the poor thing is not used to that kind of a treatment, so she goes barreling off. Who's convinced that Marilla's coming back with nobody? Because not me, Marilla. Not me. I am not. But here we are on to Chapter 5. Hear it loud and clear, just as long as it's convenient. Okay, normally I wouldn't record this late with the lighting being so bad, but I'm on a roll, so I just want to get one more chapter in. All right, so we are on to Chapter 5, Anne's History. From the title, if you've been paying attention, you know we are in for a lot of lore. Anne lore, told by Anne herself in the most Anne way. Anne declares confidently that she has made up her mind to enjoy the ride, stating, "You can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly," with firmly in all caps. Anne immediately starts pointing out different things on their drive, such as a rose, that makes her wonder how happy it must be to be a rose, and how nice it would be if they could in fact talk. She calls pink the most lovely color, and then insults herself and her hair once again by saying no matter what she ever does, she could never wear pink. Even in her imagination, it does not work. I see what she means because of undertones and everything, but I bet you there's some cool pinks that she could wear. I bet you. She asks Marilla if she's ever met anyone who grew out of their red hair, and Marilla says, "No, I don't know as I ever did," says Marilla mercilessly, "and I shouldn't think that it'd happen in your case either." Anne sighs and says that's another hope for her graveyard of buried hopes. She admits that she read in a book once, and it's something she says to comfort herself when she's disappointed. I love it. Marilla is confused how that could comfort her at all to think of the graveyard, and Anne explains the comfort, in fact, comes from feeling as if she was a heroine in a book. She says a graveyard of buried hopes is one of the most romantic things she could think of. Oh. She asks if they're going to be going over the Lake of Shining Waters again, and Marilla, in her dry way, has to correct her and say, "You mean Barry's Pond?" And she says no, they're not going by the same road. They're going by the shore road instead. She goes on and on dreamily about how wonderful it must be to have a town with the name of White Sands. But she does admit it doesn't sound as lovely or as musical as Avonlea does, and I would agree. She asks Marilla how far they have yet to still go. So Marilla responds, "It's 5 miles, and as you're evidently bent on talking, you might as well talk to some purpose by telling me what you know about yourself." Anne responds by saying her life is simply not worth sharing about, and the things that she imagines are far more beautiful and amazing than anything that has happened to her in her life. But Marilla insists and says to stick to the absolute facts. She starts at the beginning, asking Anne where she was born and what her age is. Anne explains with a sigh that her birthday, last March, she turned 11. They don't give a birthday, and I want a birthday because my birthday's in March, and I want to know. I want to know. What is her birthday? Do we share a birthday? She says she was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. Her father was a teacher, Walter Shirley, and her mother was Bertha Shirley. Anne remarks that she is so grateful that her parents' name are beautiful names, unlike Jedediah. Sorry, Jedediah, she hates your name. Anne says that she read in a book once that a rose by any other name would still smell just as sweet, but she doesn't believe that. A rose called the skunk cabbage would absolutely not smell as sweet. Even with a name like Jedediah, her father still could have been a good man. Anne also states that her mother was a teacher as well, but she had to quit to get married. And Anne also says that while that's the reason she was given, she'd like to think it was because having a husband was enough work already. Mrs. Thomas, who she tells us all about soon enough, told her parents were a pair of babies and poor as church mice. Anne mentions that she has imagined the little yellow house in Bolingbroke where they lived and how she imagined, at least, that it looked 1,000 times. Of course it would have muslin curtains, because as we go on, Anne is a huge fan of muslin curtains. She says that they would have it in every single window. We learn that she was born in that house, and Mrs. Thomas actually called her a homely baby. But her mother thought she was absolutely beautiful, and I think I agree with her mother. I'm pretty sure Anne was stunning. And already, from the little tiny bit we've learned about Mrs. Thomas, she's no gem. She is absolutely no gem. Anne is grateful that her mother cherished her for the short time they had together, as when Anne was just 3 months old, her mother died of a fever, and her father just 4 days later. At 3 months old, she was just an orphan with no one in the world that cared about her. Anne wishes her mother could have lived long enough that she could have remembered calling her mother. This poor girl. Now, it wasn't Anne's idea to tell this story to try to guilt them into keeping her or convince them. Marilla is the one that insisted she gets Anne's background, and there's no way this isn't pulling at her heart. Mrs. Thomas told Anne that becoming an orphan had everyone in the town absolutely at their wits' end because her parents weren't from the area and had no family otherwise. Mrs. Thomas was drunk. Mrs. Thomas had a drunken husband, and they were very poor. Anne then asks Marilla if there's something special to people being brought up by hand that others don't have. Because every time she was naughty, by Mrs. Thomas's standards, every time Mrs. Thomas called her naughty, she would tell her in a very reproachful-like way, how could she be such a bad girl when she had been raised up by hand? Anne immediately moves on. The Thomas family moves to Marysville, and Anne says that she lived with them and took care of their children until she was about 8. That's when Mr. Thomas was killed by a falling tree, and Mrs. Thomas was going to stay with her mother, but she didn't want to take Anne. She says once again that Mrs. Thomas was at her absolute wit's end on what to do with Anne, when Mrs. Hammond from up the river came and took her to a very, very lonesome place to care for her children. Mrs. Hammond had a sawmill and 8 children. 8. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in a succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair came. I used to get dreadfully tired carrying them about. She was 8 when she moved there, and she stayed there until she was 10. Remember that, with all of her little things that she talks about how exhausted she was there from 8 to 10. Do you remember how long life took as a child? How every day seemed to be like 5 of today's days at the least? Imagine this, and I know it's not uncommon in our world to have children who struggle, children who are abused, children who are not treated fairly, adults, everybody. But this is just a narrower scope, kind of focusing in directly on Anne. And I felt like I had to say that because at that point, it came into my own head that, okay, yeah, but there's so many things that have gone on worse that she didn't have to deal with. But, I had to just say that, okay? People pleaser, what? I told you I'm working on it. Once again, Anne ends up leaving when the husband passes away. Mrs. Hammond split up all her children among relatives and went to start a new life in the States. And of course, this is the time that Anne ends up at the asylum for 4 months, even though she states they didn't want her either. And then Mrs. Spencer came, and here she is. Anne finishes with a sigh of relief. She doesn't like talking about this, and honestly, who could blame her? Who wants to just spill? The lack of depth that has gone into here, just about the different things that happened to Anne, is another part of why I feel like she's a more cheery, kind of sanitized version of a child with PTSD that has gone through a lot. Yes, she goes into the history of her life and talks about it. Marilla demands, as they turn down Shore Road, to know whether Anne has had schooling or not. She admits not very much, only the last year she lived with Mrs. Thomas due to not being close enough to a school. And, of course, when she was at the asylum, she also got a little bit of education. She does, as you probably already assumed, have the ability to read and write and has memorized many poems. She says that she loves the crinkly feeling that she gets all up and down her back when she reads poetry, stating, "The downfall of Poland is full of thrills, Marilla. I don't know what the downfall of Poland is, but you know that I'm looking it up after this video." Marilla, out of the corner of her eye, kind of like glancing over at Anne, asks, "Were these women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" "Oh," falters Anne. Her sensitive little face suddenly starts turning scarlet, and embarrassment sits on her brow. Oh, they meant to be. I know that they meant to be just as good as and kind as possible. And when people mean to be good to you, you don't mind very much when they're not. Quite, always. They had a good deal to worry them. It must be very trying to have a drunken husband. Or to have twins 3 times in a succession. So Marilla starts distractedly driving and asks Anne no more questions, instead pondering what she just heard. Pity stirring up in her heart. She couldn't imagine the life that this young starved girl had had. I mean, poetry and neglect. And it suddenly clicks to Marilla why Anne reacted the way she did when she got at Green Gables and found out that she wouldn't have had a home. She then starts to entertain keeping her for Matthew's sake, of course. And for hers, as the girl does seem very teachable. She tries to convince herself that it wasn't as bad as it seems for Anne, and that these must have been really nice folks. Anne rouses from what I am sure was a trip on the dissociation train. She looks around, admiring the sea that is now visible. She remarks that once when she was little, Mrs. Thomas brought them to a shore about 10 miles away, and she has, in fact, lived there, happily in her dreams for many years. The one in front of her, however, is so much nicer than the one she had been to. And then, of course, Anne goes on in her Anne way to talk to Marilla and ponder what it would exactly be like to be a seagull. And I wonder if this time Marilla is kind of listening through a different lens. And as I was writing this script, I started to realize that Anne first tells all of her history, and then as soon as she comes back to herself, goes into rambling about random things. And this is something that I've noticed myself doing. If I talk about something really difficult, I might immediately start talking about Grey's Anatomy or talking about another TV show I love. And for me, it kind of calms me down and regulates me, and then I can come back to the really difficult conversation. And I'm just wondering if this is one of those unintentionally using her skills moments. So Anne sees a house that she's afraid is Mrs. Spencer's, but is relieved when she finds out that it's not, as she doesn't want this drive to ever end. And Anne, I get it. I hate when things